keeping with the theme of videos of goons doing pretty interesting things in tanks that I don't have, here we have a match in the Churchill Gun Carrier, or as it is colloquially known, the Churchill Garbage Carrier. This tank is, in theory, it sounds interesting. You have a very sturdy, well-armoured chassis, the Churchill, which is, very well-armoured for Tier 5 and moderately well-armoured for Tier 6. You take a massive gun, the 32-pounder, and drop it into the chassis and make it a tank destroyer. It's low to the ground because the Churchill has, a fairly low profile. And you think, armoured gun, probably decent camo for something with such a powerful gun at this tier? How could you go wrong? Well, the British found a way. And, of course, if the British found a way, that means Wargaming found a way. So we have 214 pen AP rounds, 250 alpha. That's good for a tier 6. That's very good for a tier 6. APCR goes all the way up to 246 pen. That will deal with a lot of tanks. 246 is comfortable enough to deal with basically everything up to tier 9s and most tier 10 mediums. HE is HE, let's not even bother talking about it. The problem with the Churchill GC is that the front armour, it isn't. So even though in theory, because it's a Churchill, you would think it would have very thick armour, it doesn't. It's actually thinner than a standard Churchill, from what I recall. Meaning you have this giant block of easily penned, flat, near perpendicular, not quite, armour bolted to the front of your vehicle. Everyone's going to shoot at it. It's impossible to miss. Absolutely impossible to miss. Of course the little storage boxes aren't hit boxes. They won't be damaged. But who needs to shoot at them when you got this coming at you? Of course, there's no gun mantlet. As such, there's a sort of ball joint, a little universal joint, but there's no actual shield over it. So I'm not sure what thickness that is off the top of my head, but it's not very well protected. The gun is set low and to the right, so if you come up to a decent obstruction, I'll just cut myself off mid-sentence, that actually penned the mantlet and bounced off the turret armour behind the mantlet, which is why it said it penetrated but did no damage. Something a lot of people seem to have trouble understanding. Anyway, to continue on, if we just quickly pause the game, pop out of the tank, let's take a look. So, this thing here, I think is either the gun sight or a machine gun. I'm not sure. This wasn't a common production vehicle, so I'm not as well versed on it as many other tanks. This is the driver's hull here. So the driver's sitting behind that. He has like a little armoured hatch there. And this is where your gun's mounted. So your gun is mounted almost, well in fact it is mounted flush with the upper deck. Now the Churchill's hull is fairly low to the ground, so you run into a problem if you come up to a tank with very, very good hull armour. You can't really do anything to it because you can't aim up enough to get the cupola, or if you can aim up enough to hit the cupola, you've got a really shitty angle then because your gun is mounted so low. You're aiming, up like this angle here, and you just bounce off. So it's a really shitty position for the gun. It's just awkward to use. It means you have all this wasted space up here, which is basically just a target for people to shoot at. That's the other thing, because your gun's offset to one side and tucked away in the corner here. You have, I know that this space is here because people take up room and so on and so forth, but this is just not fun in World of Tanks. That's not something you want. Of course, being a Churchill, it's not fast. It's agile, but it's not fast. And it's a big arty target. It's a big long tank with a big exposed engine deck. Not sure what the camouflage rating's like. I'd imagine it'll be decent. I don't think it would have good camo, but I don't think it would have particularly bad camo either. So, if it sits right at the back and manages to get hits in on the enemy from a distance, this tank could probably put out a lot of hurt and do alright. The thing is, there's not many situations where you're able to do that, and say you land on a city map in this, you're going to have a very, very bad day. You really need a situation where you can just hide in the bushes and be a puppy. In this case, Errazial's found himself a pretty decent hill to work from. But again, because the gun is mounted so low in that casemate, it means he has to peer over the top of the hill with basically his entire tank to get a bead on his targets. The gun depression does seem okay, but the traverse, as you can pretty easily see, is garbage. It has very, very, very narrow gun traverse, which is not something you need to deal with when you've already got all the other problems that this vehicle has. So, you know, it's an excellent gun for the tier, but it's just a terrible, terrible mounting, and it's like every wrong decision that could have been made when designing this thing was. I mean, obviously, real war doesn't play out like world tanks, and actual tank combat is much slower and more protracted. Tanks don't drive like cars, etc, etc, etc. This thing would be probably driven to a position and parked there and used as a static, essentially like a bunker buster, really. It would just sit up with the troops, firing on fortifications and maybe tanks if it came across them, remembering that this is the sort of train of thought that led to the Tortoise, which was designed to break through the Siegfried line. Essentially, that kind of role had been long played by the artillery, but obviously there are advantages to having a motorized, tracked vehicle with good mobility and passable armor protection that does that instead of a couple of infantrymen, or artillerymen rather, wheeling a field gun right up to a building out in the open and blowing the piss out of it, which the Soviets and Germans used to do a lot. If you watch some of the archive footage of street fights in Stalingrad and Berlin, you'll see that, that the infantry, when they have a big problem, run into an enemy bunker or a position where the enemy have strong pointed themselves in a building, they just go grab the nearest artilleryman, or you know, like a howitzer or an anti-tank gun of sufficient caliber, and just get them to wheel it right up into the middle of the street and blow the piss out of it. Where possible, you know, things like Su-152s would have been used. That was the actual role the Su-152 was designed for, but shortages and all that. Now, a 32-pounder's not exactly the most accurate gun in the world, but it's not too bad considering its power compared to the tier it's in. I mean, this is, without a doubt, a very, very good gun at tier 6. You have penetration about equivalent to the BL9. Off the top of my head, I think you may actually have slightly better gold pen than the BL9 has. Obviously you like the alpha, but you trade better accuracy for less alpha. So this is, I think, either a high tier 7 or a tier 8 gun mounted in a tier 6 tank destroyer, which is pretty impressive, but again, the vehicle detracts from it very, very heavily. And this is really the best setup you could ask in this thing, being given the west side of Prokhorovka to work over. A bunch of oblivious enemies who don't know what they're doing, in tanks that you can effortlessly pen, and having enough allies around you to act as distractions. You know, that's about as good as it's going to get in this vehicle. I suspect if we were watching a replay of this trying to fight on a city map, you know, Errazial might have been having a little more trouble, to put it lightly. But I mean, it is an interesting vehicle. I don't think I'd want to play it because it would be suffering, but I kind of almost want to get it just because it's so bizarre. Again, I mean, it's the theory of it makes sense, and remembering the early Churchills actually did have a 75mm hull-mounted gun as well as the turreted gun. It's easy to see where the layout from this came from. They simply took the hull gun of the Churchill, replaced it with a much bigger one, and then to make room for the mount, they extended the hull armor up into a casemate and removed the turret. It's pretty obvious where the thinking was in the design of this vehicle, but in World of Tanks practical terms, not a good setup. Again, different to real combat. So a lot of vehicles that actually performed admirably in real combat don't perform well in World of Tanks simply because of little idiosyncrasies in their design. Much like that, like the AT series tanks having think it was the AT-8 that has its gun offset to one side. I'm pretty sure it's AT-8. You know, it's and the Lee, for example. The Lee worked really well when it was first introduced, simply because it had the biggest gun of essentially anything in North Africa that wasn't a Tiger. But the issues that make the Lee unpleasant to play in World of Tanks, you know, not having the second gun functional, being easily flanked, stuff like that, that wasn't a problem in the Western Desert because, you know, it's the desert. You're not going to get flanked that easily, or if you are flanked, it's going to be from a very long range, and they still have to close the distance to get in amongst you. When it comes to actually just having a straight-up tank battle, the Lee performed very well. Obviously, as the Germans brought in later tanks with bigger guns, the Lee lost its charm, and it was replaced pretty much as soon as the Sherman arrived, because it had a similarly big gun, but a mounted turret which could traverse all the way around, and the tank itself was just much better laid out and more user-friendly. So, moral of the story, if you're going to make a request for your favourite World War II vehicle, whatever, to be included in World of Tanks, or if you want to make the argument on the forums that such and such vehicle is underpowered because in real life it was a monstrous killer, you have to think about how things translate, and how the game mechanics adapt things from real life. For example, in World of Tanks, I think there's some vehicles that move at their sort of at a wargaming set speed, just an arbitrated speed for balance, but most vehicles in World of Tanks move at their theoretical maximum road speed over any kind of terrain, unless obviously you run into issues with terrain resistance and power to weight ratio and so on. But so things like that are abstracted. Again, reload times, all this stuff that differs between the actual tank and World of Tanks can make it a very different beast in game. For another example, look at the IS-7. The way the IS-7 works in game, nothing like the IS-7 actually did work. The French autoloaders, the Lorraine 40-ton wasn't actually an autoloader. It had a standard semi-automatic gun, same as any other tank gun as far as I'm aware. I did actually have a copy of the original documentation for the Lorraine floating around on my PC somewhere, all in French obviously. Thankfully I could remember just enough to be able to read it. But again, a semi-automatic gun that was abstracted into an autoloader in World of Tanks to fit the rest of the tree, whereas the IS-7 didn't have an autoloader because at that point they weren't added to the game, and also you know, again, to make it fit the tree. And Wargaming do this. They will adjust a tank from how it realistically operated. They won't make it a completely different vehicle necessarily, but they'll make little changes here and there to make something fit the line better, or to make it fit the game mechanics better. And in the case of the Churchill gun carrier, unfortunately you would have to completely reconfigure the tank to do anything to help it. It's just, the design works for something you use a sort of self-propelled anti-tank gun or self-propelled bunker buster. It does not work as a sort of World of Tanks tank destroyer, unless you want to play it like a complete shitter and hide in the back and snipe, which again sometimes is appropriate, sometimes works, but it doesn't give you the flexibility you really want in a vehicle in this game. And there are other vehicles, of course, that share that attribute, and unsurprisingly most of said vehicles are also very unpopular. Nobody really likes a one-trick pony in a game where, you know, you have to first get the right map, then get the right sort of strategy from your team, the right counter-strategy from the enemy, and, you know, the right amount of good players and bad players. Everything has to kind of fall into place for some tanks to work, and this is one of them. So, personally, those are the kinds of tanks I try and avoid, or if I have to play through them, I usually don't play them any more than I absolutely must, even if I keep them just for the sake of collection purposes. Anyway, I've droned on long enough about this thing. That's probably the only real look at it you're going to get here, because I don't really intend on playing it. I'm probably going to skip most of the way up the Tortoise line with free XP, but that's not going to happen for a long time. It's kind of on the back burner. As much as I enjoyed the Tortoise on test, it's not a priority. I've got other things I want more. I still need to get my STB-1, and of course now the British tank destroyers, the new line of them, sorry. The Archer looks like it's going to be very interesting to play. The Achilles I could take or leave, but the higher tier ones, particularly the Charioteer, the tier 8, very, very keen on that tank. I think the Charioteer and I are going to be very, very good friends. So I'll cut this one here. I wish you guys the best of luck in the field, and I'll see you on the next one.